Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Tim Canning. Tim is the OT cybersecurity consultant. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everybody. My name's Tim Canning. I'm an operational technology cybersecurity consultant. I'm working predominantly in the upstream oil and gas industry, but we are also working downstream energy, manufacturing, all over the place.
Okay, so how did you get started off in the energy sector?
I fell into it more or less by accident. After I left the Air Force, I was looking for a job, wandered around a few job agencies handing out a paper CV back in those days. And one of them sent me to a company called ICSS Triplex in a nearby town, who built safety systems, or still do build safety systems for industrial plants. And at the time, the majority of that was for the then fast-growing UK North Sea.
So do you find that work enjoyable? Because I know a lot of people do it, and a lot of people have their own perception of it as well that don't do it.
I did. I stayed with ICS for 17 years, working my way from just being the most junior switch clicker on the shop floor in the test department, all the way through to being a senior commissioning engineer, and then being embedded in Shell for 5 years as their own kind of round-the-clock support engineer for all of the different ICS systems they had, which is kind of how I ended up in Aberdeen, actually.
Okay. Do you think that because I know that a lot of instrumentation engineers, they don't like to touch the ICSS or ICS system. Do you think it's a lot different to instrumentation?
Yeah, that's quite a qualified yes. I was lucky enough to start working on particularly the safety systems, the bit that people really don't like to touch, because it's designed to shut you down. So you do anything to it, and it's like, to a certain degree, a bit of bomb disposal. I've had more than one fraught conversation with an OEM after all the lights have gone out whilst I was working on something and we pulled the wrong wire out. To the point at ICS, we used to have a league table of the amount of darkness that we'd created amongst the service engineers. It wasn't that we were taking it lightly, because we didn't, but to a certain extent, it is quite stressful when you're in and around somebody's live plant, and you know that everything you do, if you do any part of it wrong, is going to end up with somebody shouting at you for loss of production and time to restart, and everybody's eating cold meals and sandwiches rather than a roast dinner at lunchtime. So it was a little way amongst ourselves to handle the kind of, it's the mild stress that comes with that. But I was lucky enough to start on the shop floor, so I got to make a lot of the mistakes in an environment where all it meant is we had to restart a test. There was no loss of production. Most instrument engineers, the first time they're going to touch one of these kind of systems is on a live plant. Mm. So where the ramifications of pulling out the wrong wire or putting the wrong piece of code in is a bit more serious.
It is, actually, and I work on that system as well. It's quite a volatile system that a lot of people don't want to go near, actually. Yeah,
it's something that I think once you've been doing it for a while, you become not blasé to it, but you settle into the fact that you do know what you're doing, and the thing that you're going to do, you've done before and it worked. But it is still, I don't know about you, but every time I press a commit or start a software upload with a view to it actually changing a live controller, there's always that moment of like just a little pause before you press the button where you mentally run through, have I really done it all correctly? Yeah. What it does do is it means when we're doing FATs and testing onshore or away from site, you pay a lot more attention to it.
Yeah, you do, especially if you're working on a live plant. It is quite high stakes, because you could end up shutting down the whole plant for quite several hours, actually.
Yes, the longest I've managed to shut down anywhere was 7 days.
Wow.
But That's a whole story in its own right. There was something else wrong with another piece of kit that wasn't ours, but what it did was it sent a really large electric shock through the combined safety system on the IDA, which nobody really, there were no experts left. It was the very last one of its kind. And by the time myself and the colleague I was out there with left 7 days later, we were experts because we'd had to touch every part of it. But that was a difficult one. You know, like I say, it led to a lot better understanding of that particular control system, whereas before we just hoped it didn't break.
I do have an appreciation for it, yeah. Yeah. There are just a lot of times where the ICSS system can go down, but it's nothing to do with the actual system itself. It comes off of one of the other systems that communicates with it.
And this is one of the things about OT security is there are so many interactions between different systems that are not always fully appreciated, that it has to be a holistic approach. You have to look at the whole thing, because just because you've done great cybersecurity on the ICSS and, you know, it's particularly its safety parts, it might be one of the downstream systems, a monitoring system that's feeding information in that can be spoofed in a way that causes the ICSS to do something that it shouldn't, or do something that it should, but at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And it's understanding the criticality of the information that's being fed by something you might consider to be realistically very low importance. You know, if an attacker gets hold of one of the ones that we looked at on the Buzzard when I was very first getting involved in this for Nexon as it was then, CNOC as it is now, there was a PLC on the macerator which was dealing with all the kind of black waste. And it's like, well, you know what? If that goes down, it doesn't really matter. It's a unit. We'd send a Tiffy down and we'd just replace it. You know, if the hacker gets hold of that, well, yeah, that's fine, except for the fact that there are a whole bunch of pieces of information that feeds into the ICSS that could cause actions and reactions. So whilst the device itself, really low criticality, actually the information that it provides, that's different. And the networks it was on had other things on that could also be considered to be critical. Now, that's not the case now, because as a result of proper risk assessment, that was identified and changed. So in a lot of cases, risk assessment will tell you that this piece of kit's really not, actually, you know, we can live without it if it comes to it. But it's not always what that piece of that machine is doing. It's what data it's providing to the overall process. And that is something that's taken generally the OT cybersecurity community a while to understand and to factor into risk assessments, and to take a bit more of a higher level view of the overall data structure of plants. And it's complex. One of the things we've become really good at is moving information around networks to make an overall plant work without necessarily properly understanding what all those interactions are or how the networks they're on actually work. Because most controls engineers, we plug it in, we put IP addresses in, we don't really know why those IP addresses are what they are, and it all just starts working. Right, fine, move on, next commissioning task.
Mm-hmm.
Getting under the hood of that can be tricky.
It can be. So do you recommend anybody to have a build a career on working on the ICSS systems?
I think it's great. It's led me in all sorts of different directions. And one of the things I've been messing around with recently is CAN bus in cars. And again, I genuinely had no real concept before I started messing around. I bought a Mini Cooper nearly 2 years ago, and one of the things that's really good for being modded. But there are 96 different computing devices on the network, and this is in a Mini. If you go into a high-end BMW or something, you end up with hundreds of devices. The headlights are independent computing devices on the network. It's crazy. But I wouldn't have been, I guess, skilled enough or interested enough if I hadn't been working in the field of ICSS, control automation, control and instrumentation. So it's given me an appreciation of how different pieces of kit to each other and are interconnected and interact. And I'm 37 years into my career now, and I still get a buzz when I press the button on a screen and something physical happens in the real world. It's silly, but I still find it really cool.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So, as you spent a vast majority of your career in one company, back in the olden days, back years ago, that was normally that was the norm. The norm. It's not like that nowadays. Do you think it's beneficial to stay with one company?
At the time, yes, for me. And I guess to a certain extent, it depends on the company. But if you're in a place where the work is good, you're being paid what you're worth or something approaching it, because I think we all think we're probably worth more money than we actually get. But you know how the organization works. You can prompt it to get the things that you need to get your job done relatively easily. That was why I hung around at ICS. I was working with really good people in a great environment, doing a job that I genuinely enjoyed, although I would probably have never told my manager that. And I understood the organization enough that without having to try too hard, I understood all the processes and procedures. Yeah. I guess the question then begs, why did you leave? And there is also, for me, I was getting a bit stale. And after 17 years of doing much of the same thing, the thing that organization didn't provide at the time was much in the way of advancement, or at least progression in the job role.
Okay.
And that wasn't their fault. There was circumstances for that. So for me to change things up a bit enough the work became interesting again was to move and take on new challenge, because at the time I started life as a comms and radar engineer in the Air Force on airborne systems, fell into control and automation for ICS Triplex, predominantly in the safety system side of things, and then went to work for Wood Group my job title was instrument engineer, although I'd been quite clear with them that I wasn't. But they were struggling to recruit at the time. This was 2006 when there was a people resources crunch in Aberdeen. So they put me through a significant amount of instrumentation training so that I became, I hope, competent to a degree as an instrument engineer. I'm still very much more a controls engineer than I am an instrument engineer. But instead of just dealing with predominantly fire gas and ESD systems, all of a sudden you've got the entire control and automation suite for an upstream oil and gas platform to look after. There's a whole new, I had to learn about compressors and pumps and managing systems, all sorts of different things. And it was a vertical learning curve, but that's fun too. Stressful, but fun.
Yeah. How did you deal with the stress of working on the ICSS system? Because it is a major system. I think a lot of people don't realise how important it is.
I worked with Honeywell quite a lot, and one of the Honeywell engineers I was often offshore with used to use an analogy of a spider at the center of a web. You know, the ICSS is talking to every other control system on the plant, regardless of what plant it is. And I saw a network diagram for the ICSS that looks after the Sadara plant in Saudi Arabia 7 or 8 years ago. That was a £5 billion onshore chemical plant that was taking Saudi oil and turning it into almost everything you can turn oil into. And it was just vast. I think there was something like 4,000 other systems that it was touching across a plant that's the same size as Aberdeen. You know, it's just insane. But even within the ICSS, obviously you've got the 3 key elements, but then you've got everything else that it's potentially connected to. And as DCS has become CSS, has become ICS, SES, and then the full plant integration that we have now, where the ICSS could well be everything on the plant, from metering through turbine, through pump control, through unit control panels, through electrical power distribution and power management, power generation. Everything is all on the same, inside the same box. You've got to know an awful lot to be able to configure, manage, and commission these systems.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those, you end up with a lot of aligned knowledge. I don't know if that's the right term. You end up knowing an awful lot about a lot of other things. I when I started working for Wood Group, one of the things that I found I needed was I needed to go and learn about compressors and compression, because although I could look after the PLCs and the control system and all the software backups and industrial protocols and all the various elements of it, I didn't actually know anything about what it was controlling. And so I went and did a Kelton 3, not Kelton, that was the metering. That was another thing. I went to a place near Inverurie and did a 4-day compressors and compression techniques course.
Mm-hmm.
And again, at that point, you start learning about things like surge and safety lines and all of the kind of controllers that go with that from CCC and people like this. Although I was a software engineer first, you become aware at least, and I wouldn't say competent, but I'm certainly not a rotating machinery engineer, but of any stretch. But I certainly understand how a compressor works and what it does and what some of the safety features need to be. I understand power generation. I understand HV and LV switching. And, could I design any of that from scratch? No, not an electrical engineer either. But I know how to control it. And it gives you enough of an appreciation that, for example, I've just ordered a battery storage system for my house, but I had a really interesting and informed conversation with the electrical company that are going to come and fit it yesterday. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if it hadn't been for the fact that one part of the kit that I've been responsible for over time was the power management, electrical distribution, and electrical generation. So again, it's a great side benefit of the career, is that you get a lot of experience around a lot of different industrial processes and plant machinery.
Okay. Where do you see your career going in the future?
I would like to start putting it back into the next generation. OT cybersecurity is still very new. It's gone mad in the last 5 years. And the legislation that's coming through in Europe and the UK, and to a lesser extent in America, is going to drive another generation of that expansion. I fell into it again, mildly by accident. There's an incident in Iran, funnily enough, given what's going on at the moment, at the Natanz nuclear processing facility that the Iranians have built for themselves back in 2008. And it's using a malware that became known as Stuxnet. And over time, it became obvious that particular malware was far too refined and well programmed to have been put together by a bunch of script kiddies in their bedroom one day. And it was targeted at a single plant. So very clearly a nation state attack. There's a great documentary called 0 Days on it. But that really started the whole OT cybersecurity world, because it became very clear that actually you can write malware that will target control systems. And no one had done that before. There'd been a few instances of people messing around with stuff using remote access and these kind of techniques, but no one had written a malware that would find its own way into a particular plant to do it damage. So Stuxnet is like the granddaddy of all OT cybersecurity in reality. But that led to us, I was working for BG Group at the time, and we just got a random email from head office saying, change all your passwords on all your OT kit. And it's like, what? Why? We had a conference call about a week later, and it was explained why, at which point we discovered that about half of the passwords on our kit on our offshore platforms we actually couldn't change because they were hard coded. And that was interesting enough that I spent a lot of time on it. And then when I eventually left BG to go and work at Nexon, it became part of my job as the systems lead to take on what they called then the Industrial Network Security Project, which we ran for the next 5 years before I eventually left Nexon, having decided I liked it enough to become a full-time freelance OT cybersecurity engineer, which is what I've been since 2017. So my next 5 years is probably developing the team that I'm head of OT cyber for ICSS now. So working on building and developing that. But at the same time, I'm building training, and I've been teaching over the last 10 years for Firebrand down in Cambridgeshire. They have a preparation course for the Global Industrial Controls Security Professional, GICSP cert, which is one of the industry standard exams from the SANS University in America. But that's a very theoretically based certification, which is a great place to start. If you're in the world of IT and you don't really know what all this OT stuff's about, GICSP is a great place to start. But what it won't necessarily teach an instrument engineer is how to harden a PC or why. So you can go on that course and come away from it with an enormous amount of knowledge and no actual ability to do anything that would actually help make anything more secure. So there's still room for a lot more training, which is going to take someone that's got some of these fundamentals and say, right, okay, here's how you apply it. You can go back to your place of work and actually start making things more secure without breaking the ability of the machine to actually run. Because you can make things so secure that actually the OT system just won't work. So this is where it comes into understanding the interactions and the data flows and how the networks actually work, and what you're going to allow through and what you're not going to allow through, and what's normal and what's not. So I'm at a point where I would quite like to start enabling those people, because I've gone through the phase of having to learn all that because there was no one to teach us in the first round of people getting into it. We had to just learn. I was fortunate enough whilst I was at Nexon to work with a gentleman called Mike Rapley, who is now at Enquest. He was the IT security engineer for Nexon in the UK. And we pretty much taught each other. He taught me a lot about cybersecurity, and in turn, I brought him into the world of engineering and CNI. And, we're still really good friends now, but it was a great exchange of knowledge. So now I need to effectively do what Mike did for me for other people.
Okay. Do you like giving back and giving in performing training courses?
I do. I actually genuinely do. I like standing on stage and speaking at conferences. I like the training course. It's always really nerve-wracking. The Firebrand courses start on a Sunday night. There's a 2 or 3 hour kind of first meet and greet, get some of the more basic, course admin out of the way, that kind of thing. And I always get an attack of stage fright in the 15 minutes leading up to all the students, the 20 odd students walking into the room for the first time. But once you stand up and say, good evening, hi, my name is, it just starts to flow. And I really enjoy it because every course is different. And you've got another 20 individuals that you've got to try and tailor to their specific background. We might have a course of 10 instrument engineers and 10 IT professionals. So with the instrument guys, I can talk about PLCs and span and 0 points and changing ranges using HART communications. To an IT person, that's just so much foreign language. So somehow you've got to tailor the delivery of the material in real time to the people that actually walk in the door. And that's quite a challenge. I enjoy that.
Okay, so is there any downside that you've had in your career?
There have been a few moments. Back to working on safety systems, there were a number of points where you look back and think that was close. We were working on something, we were doing things right, but the test that we were doing didn't go as planned because there's some fault in the code that we'd written, and you end up with a trip There have been a couple of points where, I mean, COVID was obviously very difficult as all the work was evaporating. And I was lucky. I was working for PDMS at the time on the commissioning team, and they'd taken on a job on their Shell contract to put some metering equipment on the Nelson platform to measure gas to be imported from the former line, because Nelson at that point was considered by the petrotechnologists in Shell to be gas deficient potentially. So to run its generators, it'd need to pull gas that had already been metered off into the line, out the line. So it needed fiscal quality metering. But that was a very fast track, short timescale job. So I was, whilst everybody was being furloughed, I was working 60 hours a week trying to get this thing over the line, along with a very small team of instrument engineers. So I was exceptionally lucky. But yeah, other than that, I mean, one of the things that upsets a lot of thespians is when people like, Patrick Stewart say, I've never been out of work. I've been an actor since I was 15 and I've never not had something to go to. But touch wood, I've been lucky enough to actually only have 1 month in my career where I wasn't employed since I left the Air Force when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to think that over the next 10 years I can maintain that record, but we'll see.
Do you think that's easy maintainable to keep on working? Because a lot of people are being made redundant. Do you think it helps having a niche job, skills?
I must admit, when I took on the industrial network security project at Nexon, there was an element in my mind that this looks like something that's going to grow and become a discipline area, because it wasn't back in 2013. And there was a thing in my mind that this is future-proofing my potential for being employed. So, yeah, I think having some skills and trying to identify where there might be a demand next. But that's easier said than done. And to a certain extent, it needs also to be something that you've got some kind of background towards. And what I mean by that is the move into OT cybersecurity wasn't a gigantic career change step for me. You know, I've been writing software. I was taught how to write software back in the days of BASIC and ADA and Fortran in the Air Force. And that turned into writing code for safety systems and then coding for PLCs and DCSs. So moving into understanding the network. So I already understood computers and computing, and I'd been around networking, even if I didn't really understand how it worked. So, you know, if I was coming from being an HR professional and wanting to go into cybersecurity, not to say that you can't do it, but it's going to be a longer road. You're going to have to start from a point further back, maybe, than somebody that's already coding for ICSS or building control systems.
Yeah, I do agree. So, did you have any mentors during your career? And what was the most important thing they taught you?
I've had a few, actually. I've been very lucky that there's been some people along the way that were not necessarily older heads. Some of them were wiser heads. We were a very young team at ICS in the field services side of things because the business sort of didn't do it in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, they were very much an equipment builder that would pass it on to the client at the factory gate and say, right, yours, off you go. Mm. And we're being asked to provide engineers to go out and assist with commissioning because it's quite specialist kit. A very smart gentleman called Bob Chapman came along and realized that from a career perspective for him as a manager, this is a growth area and he could probably make the business a bunch of money and obviously do himself a service as well. But Bob was a great person manager. And he took a bunch of very young, very early 20s engineers with all the kind of confidence that comes with being completely indestructible at 20 that we all remember, and turned us into a pretty professional team. I'm not entirely sure how he did it, but I benefited quite heavily from his influence. And unfortunately, one of the guys that was a real mentor passed away a week before last, a gentleman called Mike Wakeling. And he was actually a commercial guy, he wasn't an engineer at all. But what he had was a presence, just a very calming, very sensible, very pragmatic presence that, again, as a mid-20s engineer that's flying, doing great stuff, moving all over the world, and he had a great way of just pricking your ego if it got just a little too cocky, just a little joke or a comment at your expense that was obviously banter, but it'd just bring you back down a little bit. So like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. More recently, the manager that I worked for at Nexon, a gentleman called Neil McLaren, was a huge influence on the way that I approach problem solving. Neil has a very strong way of looking at something, breaking it down into a series of steps that are all very executable, and he's the absolute master of the smart action. And probably there are a half a dozen other people that I should probably mention I'm not thinking of now. But along the way, yeah. And it's really important, and it's something that I want to, or I've tried to put back in, as now that I'm maybe the engineer with the grey hair and a bit of age and experience under my belt, because you need that along the way. We all need to have someone that you can bounce things off of. And like I say, that doesn't necessarily need to be someone older than you. There are people that I should probably mention along the way who have just been like a trusted advisor or just a friend, I guess, that you can trust inside the corporate environment, that you can go and say, look, am I being an idiot? Is this right? Am I thinking about this the right way? And who will be honest enough with you to say, actually, no, you're being a bit silly here. The reality is maybe not like that. I think it's important to try and identify those people, but it's also important to give trust, especially in bigger corporate environments. It can be tricky because there's a lot at stake, but you do need to find those people that you actually can trust and then lean on that.
Yeah, you do. I do agree with that. But again, with some of the younger or maybe to senior engineers, some of them find it hard to approach somebody to find that trust. How would you go about doing that?
I agree, it's difficult. That's a great question, actually. It takes time. It takes conversations, and it takes being engaged with the team around you and just feeling it out to a certain extent and working out who the people are and who the people aren't. And I think we've all got that kind of radar, that sense of who our tribe are, if you like. But it's also about not rushing into it too fast. When I started at Nexon, I had two guys working with me in the team, both of whom I have a huge amount of respect for. And I didn't understand the dynamics at the time of what my appointment into that role meant to them and what they understood the roles to be. Because as it turned out, it wasn't what I'd been told the roles were. Mm. There was a disconnect in information, and I'm not entirely sure it was deliberate. I think it's just one of those things that happens in a growing, fast-moving corporate environment. And it was probably 4 or 5 months before we eventually, all three of us, sat down and talked openly, because it was clear that the things weren't gelling the way that they should. And when all the cards were laid on the table, it was like, well, actually, what information you've been given is different to the information I've been given. So actually, we're now in this situation where none of us understand the way it really is. So, okay, let's define what it really is. And actually, that was enough to sort out and turn us from being three guys working together to being a small team. And again, like I say, I was lucky to work. Both of those guys were fabulous engineers. One of them is now running his own company. One of them is leading a massive project, upgrading ICSS equipment on one of the UK's largest producing assets. So clearly at the top of their game. And it did take that point of taking a risk because it was a risk. We were all contractors. We were all very easy to be cut. And if the dynamic hadn't turned out to be right, it was every possibility that at that point, Nexon were just going to find 3 other people and have another go. So I haven't had to do this for a while. How would I approach it now? I think there is a bit about giving trust and then seeing what the results are and building it with caution and then opening it up further and further, but understanding the people that you're talking to. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if I could really quantify it.
It is a good question because you don't know how to give advice on how to, especially someone that's maybe inexperienced, how to go and find somebody that you can really trust.
Yeah. One of the things that I try and make a point of is being a good, active listener. Over maybe the last 15, 20 years, I've always worked on the principle that you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it should be in that ratio. But you also, I think you have to be a good confidant. When people come and talk to you, you need to be someone that they can talk to and trust that it won't necessarily go any further. If somebody came up to me and told me that they'd just murdered someone, then okay, I'm not going to keep hold of that.
Mm.
But if someone's saying, look, I'm struggling at work a bit, I really don't know this, I'm having a problem with this person, that's not something I need to act on unless they want me to. So if you want to come and talk to me about stuff, I'll listen, and then if that's as much as you want, that's as far as it goes. And maybe we can have a conversation about what you need to do next, but it will be up to you to go and do it. It's not necessarily something that I'm going to then scuttle off and say to other people, here, have you heard about? That's not on. That's not right. And I think that's one of the ways that you can build trust with other people, by being that person that listens and offers sensible advice. And I think people get a sense of you as being that person and are willing to reciprocate, because we all need someone that we can offload to every now and then, because it is a stressful world that we work in. It's high stakes. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of pressure to perform and deliver, especially in the current world. And that isn't limited to the upstream industries. I've got friends that work in the water industry, and obviously their production targets, aligned with us all having something in the tap when we turn it on. So there's pressure at all places.
I think it is. And I'm going to end the conversation on that positive note, actually. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Tim for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.